a 2-year-old child disappeared. The footprints suddenly stopped at a certain point. There were no other traces around, no animals, no adults, nothing at all. And 19 hours later, the child reappeared, 12 kilometers away. I am going to tell you that story now. This is something that actually happened in Oregon in 1952. The year was 1952. America was in the middle of the Korean War. The news was filled with stories from the front lines every single day, and people were carrying their worries quietly through life. In eastern Oregon at that time, there was a small town called Ritter, a remote place with only a few dozen residents, difficult to even find on a map. The surrounding area was nothing but vast ranch land and rugged mountain terrain. The nearest city was hours away by car. The Parkins family ran a cattle ranch in that town, a typical American Midwest farming family, working wide-open land and raising livestock. Everyone in the family knew the land well, and it was the kind of place where every neighbor knew every face. On the morning of April 10th, 1952, a young boy named Keith Parkins was playing outside in front of the barn with his older brothers. Keith was 2 years old. He had only recently learned to walk. He was still in diapers. It was April, but the weather in Oregon was still cold. Snow remained on the ground, and the children were bundled up in thick clothing. Keith was wearing a jacket, running around near his brothers by the barn. Then his brothers went inside to have lunch. Keith was left alone in front of the barn. He was still so young that no one thought anything of it. They planned to come back out in just a moment. But when his mother came outside to bring Keith in, the area in front of the barn was already completely empty. At first, she assumed he was hiding somewhere nearby. A 2-year-old could not have gone far. The family searched inside the barn, looked beyond the fence, and checked every corner of the yard. Nothing. Then someone noticed something. Footprints in the snow. Very small footprints. A child's footprints. They began at the front of the barn and led toward the forest. The family followed the footprints, stepping carefully along the small prints pressed clearly into the snow. They walked toward the tree line. But after about 50 meters, the footprints stopped. Suddenly, without any warning. No matter how carefully they looked around, there were no other footprints. Nothing at all. Only Keith's small prints were pressed into the ground, and then, at a certain point, they simply vanished, as if he had evaporated into thin air right there. The family immediately reached out to their neighbors. Ritter was a small town, but the word spread fast. People from surrounding communities joined in, and a search began. The problem was the weather. April nights in Oregon drop below freezing. Everyone understood that if a 2-year-old child spent the night outside in only a jacket, survival would be very unlikely. There was no time to waste. Search parties went into the forest with flashlights. Calling out to each other by name, they wandered through the darkness looking for Keith. But the night deepened with no result. Search dogs were brought in as well. A trained tracking dog picked up the scent of the footprints near the barn and moved toward the forest. But at the exact point where the footprints had stopped, the dog stopped too. It seemed unable to detect any further scent and stood there in confusion. At the spot where the footprints disappeared, the scent had disappeared too. Dawn came, but Keith did not appear. The search parties were exhausted. The family spent the night in anxiety and fear. With each passing hour, the odds that a 2-year-old could have survived the freezing temperatures alone were shrinking. 19 hours into the search, just as the first light of dawn was beginning to show, one member of the search party sent a signal. They had found the child. The place where he was found was a frozen pond, approximately 12 kilometers from the ranch. Keith was lying face down in the snow on the surface of the frozen pond. He was not moving. The searchers braced themselves for the worst as they ran toward him. But the child was still breathing. Miraculously, he was alive. As the search party lifted Keith, strange details began to stand out. His jacket was gone.
In below-freezing temperatures, a 2-year-old had somehow removed his jacket. The jacket was found nearby not long after, lying in the snow as though the child had simply taken it off and set it down. The clothing itself was even stranger. The clothes he was wearing were torn in multiple places, but there was not a single mark on his body. The clothes were ripped, yet the skin underneath was completely uninjured. No one could explain how this had happened. Keith was taken to a hospital. He had hypothermia, but his condition was better than expected. The child regained consciousness, and the adults gathered around him. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Where did you go? What happened to you? Keith's answer was a single sentence. I don't remember. Even accounting for his young age, this was not a simple childish answer. Where he had slept, whether he had met anyone, whether he had eaten anything, he remembered none of it. As if those 19 hours had been completely erased. There was only one thing he said. A cat scratched me. But no cat had ever been found in that area. No one on the ranch kept a cat. No one had ever reported seeing a wild cat nearby. Could it have been a mountain lion or a wildcat? If so, a 2-year-old child could not have survived the encounter. No one ever determined what the cat was. Now, I want to look at the most uncomfortable part of this case, the numbers. 12 kilometers, 19 hours, 2 years old. Put those numbers together, and it is immediately clear that something does not add up. A healthy adult male walking across rough outdoor terrain without stopping can cover roughly 3 kilometers per hour. 12 kilometers would take about 4 hours, and that is for a fit adult. A 2-year-old is different. A child who has only just learned to walk cannot comfortably travel more than a few hundred meters in a day, even without stopping, less than 1 kilometer per hour. And the terrain Keith would have had to cross was not a flat road. Between the ranch and the pond, there were 2 mountain ridgelines. There was dense forest, there were frozen creek crossings, and there were multiple barbed wire fences. How would a 2-year-old pass through a barbed wire fence? By bending under it or climbing over. Either way, there would be cuts on the skin. But Keith had no injuries. One person decided to test this directly with an experiment. Les Stroud, a well-known survival expert and documentary host, personally attempted to recreate the route Keith was believed to have traveled. A trained adult survival expert doing his absolute best. The result was remarkable. It took him over 20 hours to complete the route. A route that took a trained adult more than 20 hours was supposedly covered by a 2-year-old child in under 19. It is physically impossible. Researchers who have studied this case put forward 3 theories. The first theory, someone abducted the child and then left him at the pond. But this theory cannot explain the footprint problem. There were no footprints of any kind around where the child was found. If an adult had carried Keith there, the adult's footprints would have to exist. The second theory, the child walked there on his own. Les Stroud's experiment disproves this. It is physically impossible. The third theory, something we do not yet have a name for, was involved. 2 of the 3 theories have already been ruled out. Only the third remains. Keith Parkins' case caught the attention of a man named David Paulides. A former law enforcement officer, Paulides had spent decades tracking disappearances that occurred in and around America's national parks and wilderness areas. The project he created is known as Missing 411. After analyzing hundreds of cases, he identified a striking pattern. Pattern 1. The victim's footprints or tracks disappear suddenly at a certain point. Search dogs lose the scent, just like Keith's case. Pattern 2. When found alive, the victim's clothing is removed or torn, but the body has no injuries. Pattern 3. Survivors have no memory of what happened during the missing time, as if it were completely erased. Pattern 4.
The victim is found at a location that would have been physically impossible to reach on their own. Keith Parkins meets all 4 of these patterns.
There is another similar case. In 1938, at Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, a 5-year-old boy named Alfred Beilhartz disappeared while hiking with his parents. Search parties dammed the nearby creek and searched the riverbed. 10 days of searching turned up nothing. But during this search, several hikers came forward to report something strange. They said they had seen a small child sitting alone near the summit of Chapin Mountain on a cliff face that would have been impossible for anyone to climb. And beside the child, they said they saw something unknown pull the child back out of sight. What it was, none of the witnesses could ever explain. Alfred has never been found. Just a few kilometers from the frozen pond where Keith was discovered, another child vanished from the same area of Oregon several years later. The footprints disappeared. The circumstances were equally inexplicable. The same pattern, the same region, repeated. Paulides formally requested that the government release official missing persons statistics for these areas. The government's response was a refusal. No reason was given. Why won't they release the data? Let me return to Keith Parkins. Keith went on to live an ordinary life after that day. He went to school, grew into an adult, and built a life for himself. But when it came to the events of that day, he kept absolute silence. When journalists requested interviews, when researchers reached out to him, he refused every single one. Not once, for the rest of his life, did he speak about what happened. This can mean one of 2 things. Either he truly remembered nothing at all, or he remembered but chose never to say. Either way, it is more frightening. But the most unsettling part of this case is something else entirely. Among the children who came back alive, including those in cases similar to Keith's, there is something they consistently say. They were not afraid. 19 hours, in below freezing temperatures, alone, with no memory of any of it. And they were not afraid. As if they had not been alone during that time. As if something, or someone, had been beside them. As if that presence was the reason they felt no fear. What that was, even the children do not know, because they have no memory of it. Or perhaps the memory was taken from them. To this day, no official conclusion has ever been reached about this case. Not by the police, not by the search teams, not by survival experts, not by psychologists. Over 70 years have passed since 1952, and it remains unsolved. Keith Parkins has passed away. Whatever secrets he may have carried with him are now buried too. Somewhere in Oregon today, that frozen pond still exists, unfound by anyone, remembered by no one. Perhaps it knows what happened on that night in 1952. Here are the facts. On April 10, 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins disappeared from a ranch in Ritter, Oregon. His footprints stopped at a certain point, and the search dogs lost his scent. 19 hours later, he was found on a frozen pond 12 kilometers away. His jacket had been removed. His clothes were torn. His body had no injuries. He remembered nothing. A survival expert personally walked the same route, and it took even that trained adult over 20 hours. This was not a distance a 2-year-old child could have covered in 19 hours. So what exactly brought that child to that place? Nobody knows. Not even now.